people, it's ScionVise, and I love the Nintendo Switch. Yeah, not really a super interesting way to start a video, but it's true. It's a really great system, and it's really quickly becoming my favorite Nintendo console. It takes the best aspects of Nintendo's previous systems and puts them all into one package. It's a home console, it's a portable, it's got some interesting and mostly unintrusive gimmicks, and most importantly, it's got games. Lots of games. For the first time in a very long time, a single Nintendo console has the full force of all of the company's development studios behind it, and it really shows. The sheer volume of high-quality titles Nintendo's put out for the Switch has been staggering at times, and the launch year in particular was unbelievably good. But there's been one thing that's plagued a lot of these games, which don't ruin them by any means, but definitely mean they're not quite as polished as they could be. The Switch isn't a particularly powerful console, even by 2017 standards. Because of that, most games released by Nintendo, and especially third parties, end up suffering from reduced visual fidelity, lower frame rates, and especially lower resolution compared to its competitors. I know, it's not super fair to directly compare the Switch, a handheld device, to something like the PS4, but even with no comparison, when the launch year games like Breath of the Wild and especially Xenoblade Chronicles 2 get to be blurry messes on the Switch, it doesn't bode well for the technical longevity of the console. So obviously there have been rumors from day one about a so-called Switch Pro, which would inevitably release a few months from whenever that rumor came out, would be 4K, be more powerful than any supercomputer, and only cost $99. Each rumor and each leak came and went with no Switch Pro to show for it, so it's all bunk and there definitely will never be one, right? Well, maybe, but maybe not. That Switch Pro rumor mill has gotten going again, and the predictions are looking more realistic than ever before. So there's a few important points about this particular leak. Firstly, it's supposedly going to be using an OLED screen rather than the current LCD screen for handheld mode, which will have better colors, contrast, and use much less battery for the same results. Second, it's going to be using a much more powerful system on a chip with twice as much RAM, which will obviously give this new model much more horsepower. With this new power, the Switch will supposedly be capable of 4K output, compared to the Switch's current 1080p maximum. But the biggest bombshell of all of this rumor's claims is that this new Switch will make use of Nvidia's proprietary upscaling and image sharpening technology, Dlss. Dlss, or Deep Learning Supersampling, is really interesting tech. It basically uses AI-based cores in Nvidia's GPUs to render a game at a lower resolution, then upscale and sharpen the image to the game's chosen resolution. For instance, you can render a game like Control at 900p in the game's engine, heavily reducing the game's demand on the hardware, then using the AI upscaling, have the game actually render at 1440p, which is about 50% higher resolution, and have the result be basically indistinguishable to a native 1440p in terms of image quality. At least that's how it's supposed to work in the best case scenario. On paper, this is huge. The Switch, being such a small handheld system, had to make a lot of sacrifices and compromises to get everything to work the way it does. In handheld mode, it heavily downclocks the CPU to keep battery life high, and even when docked, it still has to keep the processor leashed so the Switch doesn't just burst into flames when trying to run a game. So what this leak means, if it's true, which it very well may not be, is that this new Switch will be much more powerful than the base model, will have the ability to run games at higher resolutions and frame rates than ever before, and still be able to run cooler in docked mode while having much better battery life in handheld mode. This seems too good to be true, and there's no way that something like this could actually happen, right? Well, actually, no, all of this is technically possible, and it's even possible to achieve in a form factor like the Switch. People generally see DLSS as a technology that you need a massive $1,000 desktop GPU to use, but really any NVIDIA processor based on either their Turing or Ampere architectures are capable of using it because they are built with those AI processing cores that DLSS uses. and there are mobile chips that Nintendo could use that have these capabilities. So now that we know it's possible, the real and more important questions are: 1. Would Nintendo even do something like that? And 2. Should Nintendo make a Switch Pro? The first of these questions is by far the easiest to answer, and even then it's not exactly a sure bet either way. We really only have Nintendo's previous trends in hardware development and the most recent statements on their direction to go by. On one hand, Nintendo has almost exclusively been focused on creating cheap, profitable hardware for a very, very long time. Seriously, the last time Nintendo firmly held the power crown for console hardware was back in 1996 when the N64 launched, and that only really lasted until 1998. When that was a relative failure for the company, they decided to change directions, and ever since the GameCube, their focus was never to be the best, but to do just enough to achieve what they wanted with their games while making as much money as possible on the hardware. But on the other hand, Nintendo is under new leadership now, and with that new leadership comes the possibility of a course change. Nintendo's new president, Shuntaro Furukawa, has gone on record saying that they're constantly researching new technologies, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Every tech company is constantly researching and experimenting with new stuff. That also doesn't necessarily imply anything about a Switch Pro or a Switch 2 or anything. But due to Nintendo partnering with Nvidia for the Switch, the chances of them being able to experiment with new chips and DLSS is greater than 0. So yeah, there's really no way to know with complete certainty on whether or not Nintendo would actually try to use DLSS on a Switch successor or supplementary upgrade. All of these rumors really come down to assumptions, hearsay, and hope from fans. Even the report saying that Nintendo has chosen OLED for a new Switch is a little disingenuous and not giving the full picture. I'd really like it to happen, but Nintendo's history with hardware really makes the idea of them jumping on new, somewhat untested technology is, unfortunately, a bit of a stretch. But for a few minutes, let's assume that Nintendo would and is really invested on using this in a mid-generation refresh of the Switch. The question that then arises is, should they do it? Is such a drastic mid-generational leap a good idea? This is not a clear choice either, as there are lots of positives and negatives that go along with making something like this. Let's start out with the positives first. A big Switch refresh could keep the Switch in the public consciousness more into the future. The Switch currently is over 4 years old at this point, and considering a lot of people already own one, that initial buzz from its release and the hype from its initial offering has died down a lot. PS5 is the new hotness, as I'm sure everyone who's attempted to look for one knows very well. A Switch Pro, much like the Switch Lite before it, would be a way to get the Switch back in people's minds and get buying one on the radar for many people who haven't already bought into it. Being a more powerful variant, it would even get people with a base Switch to consider upgrading. I know I would. Second, experimenting with new technology on a hardware refresh of an already hugely successful product would be quite a bit less risky than investing the R&D to gamble with a completely new one. This would allow Nintendo to learn how this new tech works, how to properly implement it, and get an actual system that uses it out there before focusing on it in the future. That's partially why the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X existed. They both used new tech that the original models weren't capable of, to experiment with it or refine it for the next generation. This applies to software as well. Nintendo could, say, revamp the eShop for the Switch Pro, or actually allow custom themes on it, which is something that the base Switch is sorely lacking. Third, and I'm putting this third for a reason, is that with a more capable system, this could encourage developers to not abandon the Switch entirely when the move to PS5 and Series X has been completed, and development on the older, weaker PS4 and Xbox One have been halted. Even as it is, many games made with the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X in mind haven't been ported to Switch at all, since it's so much less capable than its competitors, and even games that do make it over to the Switch are pretty badly made or require lots of technical wizardry to make them work properly. A Switch Pro, at least partially, would remedy that looming problem. Now I listed that one third because it leads into the first possible negative of a Switch Pro, that introducing a new SKU would discourage developers to make games for the Switch at all, since they'd now have to program for two systems, the Switch and Switch Pro, or be forced to choose. Do they take a chance on the new model, which has no install base but would result in a better product? Or do they just go for the base Switch, which would definitely make for a less polished game, but would have a chance to hit an exponentially larger market? There's no easy answer here. Monetarily speaking, developing for both may not be worth it. If studios are looking to make a profit, it's probably not wise to only develop a game for a system with no user base, and as time goes on, getting games to run properly on the base Switch may become impossible. Second is related to that in the sense that a model with a huge power difference could split the user base, and if there are Switch Pro exclusive games, cause a lot of confusion for people buying Switches. A lot of this comes down to marketing and messaging, which Nintendo is famously bad at. They did release the Wii U after all. It may be best to just not have exclusive games, but then it becomes harder to justify the system existing, especially if any game performance upgrades or DLSS usage is on a per game basis. Thirdly, the human malware problem along with the computer hardware shortage could really hamper Nintendo's ability to even produce something like this. They're having a hard enough time as is producing enough regular Switches using effectively ancient hardware that no one else is demanding. If they start requiring newer, more in-demand tech, it could be far harder to get a new system ready for launch. There's no real sign as to when this shortage will end either, so it may make more sense logistically and financially to just wait it out and put more time into developing a true next-generation Switch rather than a stopgap upgrade. So, will a Switch Pro happen? I have no idea. This video was just for fun, listing a few pros and cons more as a hypothetical than a real prediction. I personally would like to see it, especially if the rumored hardware would actually allow previous Switch games to look and run better, but if it were to be just another DSi, then it's probably better off not happening, so that Nintendo can look to the future and what they're doing beyond the Switch. But I guess we may find out either way soon, as E3 is just a few weeks away from when I'm recording this, and I can't wait to find out. So this was a bit of a different type of video from what I normally do. I wanted to try to make a more topical discussion type video rather than purely doing game reviews. This is probably a little rough around the edges, as this is my first attempt at this after all, but I hope I was at least able to get a discussion going. Everyone's always looking for the next thing and pondering the what ifs for everything else, so I figured that this would be fun. I hope you liked it, and if you'd like me to do more of these, please let me know, as I had a lot of fun making it. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all later.